second half tonight is why I think this is true. And I want to focus your attention, draw your attention to the fact that I've put true in quotation marks. This is not going to be an apologetic where we try to prove Jesus was God, or that Jesus was resurrected, or that Jesus came from the virgin birth. That any of that stuff is historically accurate. Because quite honestly, none of that stuff can be proven scientifically to be historically true. But here's where I want you to take this. Nobody asks whether or not the Cinderella story is historically true. But is there story truth in that story that we could take from it? Now, for those of you who are deeply committed Christians, I am not implying that the Jesus story is just another story like the Cinderella story. What I'm saying is, you don't need the Cinderella story to be proven to be true for you to get something out of it. If you agree with that, say yes. What I would like us to do is to first catch what the story truth is. And then there's plenty of resources we could look at as trying to discern which parts of the Jesus story are historically reliable and if there are any parts that could have been exaggerated. But before we get into that, let's not get sidetracked on that yet. Let's figure out what the story's even saying to us first off. Are you with me? Does that make sense? What is the story even whispering to us? G.K. Chesterton has gone on record. He said, the history of Christianity does not prove that the teachings of Jesus have been tried and found wanting. Some people look at the history of Christianity and say, well, why should anybody follow that Jesus? He says, the history of Christianity proves that the teachings of Jesus have been found difficult and left untried. William Temple said, if our concept of God is wrong, the more religious we get, the more dangerous we are to ourselves and others. I am not trying to turn you into a theist. I'm not trying to turn you into a Christian. All I'm putting forth tonight is, and through this series, is what the Jesus story is and what the Jesus story is whispering to us. And you're going to have to wrestle with anything outside of those teachings. The reason I want to come from that angle is because historically Christianity has gone through quite a few metamorphoses. The first great was considered by scholars to be the first great Christian heresy was the Gnostic movement in the first century. Close of the first century, second century, third century, Gnosticism. What Gnosticism taught, very briefly, was that they taught a lot of things. This is going to be a gross oversimplification. But Gnosticism, the part that we're looking at, is they taught that every person has an immortal soul that is good. But it's encased in this body, this matter that is evil, that is bad. Therefore, you needed to persecute the body to liberate the soul. There were many Gnostics that wouldn't take part in any sensory type of pleasures because that would be feeding which part of you, the soul or the body? They would say the body. That's where monasticism actually got the self-flagellation and trying to persecute the body with some of this. Well, the whole goal was to become disembodied, to get your soul free of the body into some far distant post-mortem, after death bliss. That was the goal of Gnosticism. When Gnosticism ripped through Christianity, and we're going to talk about more of this on the night we talk about the revolution and repenting of religion, what I find fascinating is that Jesus never went around trying to get people to say a special prayer so they could go to heaven when they die. How many notice that's strangely absent from the Jesus story? He wasn't trying to get people to heaven at some point in the future. He was trying to bring heaven into people's lives in the here and in the now today. It was very here and now focused, not post-mortem focused. The early followers of Jesus were much the same way. They weren't focused on post-mortem change. They were focused on bringing change in people's lives in the here and in the now. I find it fascinating that today, when someone says they're going to become a Christian, 90% of their life in the here and now will remain the same. While the only real significant change that they feel they're making is in a post-mortem destination. How many, if you see that, say yes. Not if you agree with it, if you can see what I'm saying, say yes. Okay, good. I didn't lose you on that. It was the exact opposite. When Gnosticism came into the early Christian movement, it was the very first time that Christians stopped focusing on healing the world and restoring the world. They became escapists. They were trying to just escape the world and try to get to heaven. The great Hebrew hope of the Old Testament, the prophets, was not of one day becoming some disembodied soul on some far distant cloud. The great Hebrew hope was one day Messiah would come and He would put to right all injustice, all oppression, and all violence in the earth, in the here, and in the now. Jesus came as part of that tradition. So you began to see Christians now focused more on getting to heaven than making any difference in the world today. Today's statistics state that 70% of theists, that's someone who believes in a God, 70% of theists, when they are faced with injustice on the planet, will do absolutely nothing. Now, if that statistic offends you, all that means is you're part of the 30% that actually would do something. But 70% will do how much? Nothing. Why? Because most theists aren't focused on fixing this world. They say that would be like arranging chairs on the Titanic. They're about escaping. How many bumped into that mentality within Christianity? How many have seen that? That started with early Gnosticism. That's where it began. Something happened in the 4th century that we're going to talk about too in more detail later. In the 4th century, Constantine became Christian. Who was Constantine? Anyone know your history? Roman Emperor Constantine. Overnight, Christianity became the accepted religion of the Roman Empire. Christianity went from a persecuted minority now to a persecuting majority. The ethical teachings of Jesus, which is what we've been focusing on so far, the ethical teachings of Jesus were largely set aside to embrace the Roman Empire. In other words, Constantine wasn't made to change his ethics to embrace Jesus. The whole Jesus movement changed their ethics to embrace Constantine. And you can understand why. They were a persecuted people, and we can't blame them for wanting a break. But there were some changes that were made. When you take even just the teachings of Jesus on violence, this was the first time Christians started picking up the sword in Jesus' name. This is where we see heretics being burned at the stake. This is where we see Muslims, witches, Jews being killed at the end of the sword. Christians go from loving their enemies to now killing their enemies, which would have been heresy to the early Christians who believed in the nonviolent Jesus. How did that happen? Well, we'll get into more details later, but at least know this for now. What defined you as a Christian with that ethical change was no longer are you endeavoring, poorly or not, to follow the teachings of Jesus. What defined you as a Christian was whether or not you believed in story details. Do you believe in the virgin birth? Do you believe in the crucifixion? Do you believe in the resurrection? Think for a moment of the Apostles' Creed. This is a little Christian history. The Apostles' Creed, which was not written by the apostles, says, born of the Virgin Mary, crucified under Pontius Pilate. Did they skip anything between those two events? How about the entire life and teachings of Jesus? But see, that was no longer relevant. All of that was marginalized. All of that was set aside. What made you a Christian was whether or not you believed in the virgin birth. What I find fascinating today is when I talk to my atheist and agnostic friends, do you know what we all agree on? The ethical teachings of Jesus. We all sit around the table, and my atheist friend says, well, I don't believe in God. I just try to live by one rule. And I said, well, what rule is that? They said, well, I just try to treat others the way I'd like to be treated. Well, hello? Where does that come from? That's the teachings of Jesus. Are you with me? When atheism and agnosticism want to critique Christianity, and rightly so, the things that they attack are not the ethics. What they attack are the story details. How many of you have seen the historical problems of you've been introduced to the virgin birth and the resurrection and you're aware of those debates that exist out there today. That's because what defines a Christian today is whether you believe in story details, not following the teachings of Jesus. So therefore, if they can affect the story details and prove those untrue, then Christianity doesn't have any leg to stand on. Do you see the tack? Early Christianity was radically different. Very little focus on ontology and cosmology, and more focused on values and ethics and making a difference in this world. So what you have, if you combine Gnosticism and Constantine, those two changes within Christianity, we went from a revolutionary movement in the first century of love and service and activism to bring help to the oppressed. We went from trying to change the world to now trying to get to heaven. And we were no longer trying to change the world through ethics. We were trying to get to heaven through believing story details. That's Christianity today in a nutshell. Do you want to go to heaven when you die? Then believe this, 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 and this. How many have bumped into that flavor of Christianity before? That is, praise Jesus for the exceptions. That is the lion's share of the version of Christianity that most people have been introduced to. That is not what I'm defending tonight. What I would like us to step back and look at is the early Jesus movement, not the Christian religion. The early Jesus movement, universal agreement, agnostics, atheists, Christians, we all can agree on this much. In the first third of the first century, that's the 30s, 40s, and 50s, there was a band of Jewish folk, men and women, a community that grew out of Judaism that were traveling, telling a certain story. That story was of a contemporary of theirs named Jesus, who they claimed lived an extraordinary life. This was their story. Whether the story's true or not, this was their story. This Jesus had lived an extraordinary life. They claimed that he had done miracles. He had done the supernatural. That wasn't hard for society back then to swallow. They were not modern. They were not naturalistic. They believed in the supernatural. They were not materialistic the way we are today. They claimed that he was the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, and that held grave implications in a Jewish culture with the Old Testament prophets. They didn't claim that he was a way to get to heaven. They were claiming he was a way to heal the world. They claimed that he was the Son of God, and this is before the 300s and 400s. To a Jew to claim that Jesus was Son of God is not second member of the Godhead. That was a title that only one person in the Old Testament was referred to as, and that was King David. That was the King of Israel. This was the King of Israel who had returned. And therefore he was Lord. They were saying that Jesus had come to inaugurate a new social order. Remember the circles and the pyramids? That Jesus had come to rearrange society. They claimed that this Jesus was giving a distinct ethical teaching. We'll read about what some of those were in just a second. They also claimed that he had been crucified by the established authorities. And probably the most problematic for us today, this early community claimed that they had seen Jesus after this crucifixion, that he had been resurrected and brought back to life. Whether you believe this story to be true or not, it is true that this was their story. Are you with me so far? This was the story they were telling. The original environment within Judaism would have been very hostile to this story. After all, that was the religious establishment that had crucified Jesus. At times, it was not favored by the Roman Empire, and it experienced periods of violence from the Roman Empire. Now, it was not constant, but there were periods of violence within the early Roman Empire, or within the Roman Empire of early Christianity. And lastly, number 4, what we can all agree on is that we find the basic story, the basic tenets of this story they were telling. The only references we have to that community's documents today are the versions that we have of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I will not stand up here this evening and try to defend for you their purity. They have been, how many realize they've been copied and copied and copied and copied and translated and copied? But even in the form that we have them, this week you're going to find the ethical teachings of Jesus still come through and are still just as deeply challenging to how we arrange our world today as they were arranging their world back then. So we're not saying they're perfect. What we're saying is, even in their form, is there any value in them? Let's talk about how history works for just a moment. Ancient Judaism. We have only one source for everything you know about ancient Judaism, and that's Josephus. He wrote about 90 years after the events he wrote about. Alexander the Great. Guess how many historical sources we have for him? One. And guess when it was written? Not a trick question. It's in your gray section. If you guys want to go home in 15 minutes, you got to speed up. It was written 400 years after Alexander the Great supposedly lived. Nobody argues whether or not there was an Alexander the Great. How many realize that? You got one source written 400 years after the fact. Nobody challenges that. Why? Because nobody has abused other people in the name of Alexander the Great. Sorry, that's a soapbox. Ancient Persian wars come from one source 70 years later. Almost everything we know about the Middle Ages comes from one source. Almost everything from one source. St. Bede, 200 years after the fact. How ancient documents work is we have very few original documents of anything. Everything we have that we know about history is in the same form that we find the four Gospels. They're copies of copies of copies of copies. Copies of Josephus would have been made, not Josephus's writings, copies of Josephus would have been made during a time of deep anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish flavor in culture. Therefore, I want to go on record, the sections of Josephus that deal with the crucifixion of Jesus or James's stoning will be disregarded in this series. Some Christians use them. We're going to move forward and not even need them. We're just going to disregard them. Josephus will only be used when we need to understand the Jewish culture, where scholars attest that there's little chance of copying or misinterpolation is the proper term for that. But where scholars agree, there's little chance of copyists making changes to his documents. So we will be using Josephus, but not in the matter under the two areas where Josephus is contested, being James's stoning and Jesus' crucifixion. We have other stuff for that. I've given you in the gray section too some the Old Testament passages where you can see how the Jews would have used the term Son of God and Lord. We're not making claims. We're not making wild claims to the divinity of Jesus here during this series. I'm not saying he's not divine. All I'm saying is that's not going to be a point of debate in this series. We're not looking at story details. We're looking at ethical teachings. Here's where I'm at. If I can lay all my cards on the table so you can see where I'm coming from. I am so enamored by the teachings of this itinerant teacher in the story of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm just saying I don't need all the things in that story to be true. I need the world that it postulates to be possible. In other words, I need the end goal of what Jesus was trying to accomplish. I need that to be attainable. I need that to be a real life hope for me. I need hope. Because I think the present world is pretty messed up. Anybody would agree with that? So I need the world that those ethics are showing us the way to be feasible, to be possible. I don't get hung up on all the story details. If I were God, and I always love it when people say that phrase right there, if I were God. But maybe this will help some of you in the room that are wrestling with this. We're all at different places in the journey. Are you with me? Some of you have no doubt. You're just totally assured of everything. You're blessed. Those of you who do wrestle with doubt and questions and you're a natural skeptic, I feel your pain. If I were God and I had to choose between someone who was dead sure on the virgin birth and the crucifixion and the resurrection and all the miracles, but grossly ignored the ethical teachings of Jesus, or someone who had significant wrestlings with the virgin birth intellectually and the resurrection and all of those things, but endeavored to try to follow the teachings of Jesus and make the world the kind of world Jesus was trying to make it. If I had to choose between the lesser of those two evils, I would pick the one who had some intellectual wrestling but was following the teachings versus the one that was quite sure it was all true but could care less about it changing their life. Anyone understand where I'm coming from? So that's what we're going to be appealing to. What are the actual teachings? What did this Jesus in this story teach? What's the story truth? We're not going to be looking, again, debating story details, but the teachings. And honestly, I don't care if the guy's name back then was Bob. Whoever it was teaching those things, it's the teachings that have won my heart. It's the values that have won my heart. It's the ethics that have won my heart. It makes sense. It resonates in me. So I don't care if the guy's name was Bob. Whoever it was teaching that stuff, that's who I want to follow. It just so happens that Bob was not a very popular first century Jewish name. And everybody was being named Joshua back then, which is the Aramaic version of Jesus, the Greek Jesus, yes. And so the likelihood that there was a Jesus back then teaching this stuff is pretty high. But I don't need to even get into that. The teachings alone are enough to win me. We talk about the stuff that we can know. I've got 10 minutes left. Man, we're doing so good. Let's talk about Pliny for a moment. Pliny is a extra-biblical, non-biblical, basically secular history that we're looking at here. In his letter to Trajan, he is actually he gives us the first pagan account to refer to early Christian followers. This is an outsider of the Christian community talking about the Christians. He provides us some key information on what their beliefs and practices were and how they were viewed and dealt with by the Romans. You can Google Pliny, by the way. I'm not telling you anything that Wikipedia won't either. Pliny mentions that they meet on a certain day before the light, in other words, before dawn, because they all were. Most Christians were at the bottom of the pyramid. Most people at the top of the pyramid rejected Jesus. Most people at the bottom embraced him. So they had to work every day for their livelihood. So before they would go to work, they would meet early in the morning together, and they would sing hymns to Christ as to a God. He's not claiming that Jesus is God. He's saying that they sang to him as if he was a God. The whole divinity of Jesus would not come into debate within Christianity for another couple hundred years. They all bind themselves by oath, not to some crimes, but rather they pledge not to commit any crimes, such as fraud, theft, or adultery, and they subsequently share a meal of ordinary and innocent food. What were they doing? This was bread and wine. This was the communion service. That's what their worship consisted of. Pliny eventually forbade any political associations because Trajan saw them as a natural breeding ground for grumbling. Interesting. Why do you think the Christians were viewed as being natural breeding ground for grumbling? Who are they speaking out against? The pyramid, the circle. And who was in charge of the pyramid back then? So would it make sense for Romans to say, that's a bad influence? Grumbling about civic life and political affairs. What I want you to notice is that Pliny is saying that if all the early Christians cared about was getting people to heaven, would Rome have seen them as dangerous? But because they were trying to change the way life is done on earth, was that a threat to Rome? Did they see them as having some political implications? Christianity was seen as a political association that, did we lose that? Yep, Google it. You get the point. There's only one sentence left, and that is that it wasn't Gnostic. It was trying to make changes in the world today that Rome felt was a threat to her political interests. Tacitus is the next one we get historically. And I'll read to you, this is a translation of Tacitus. He was a Roman historian. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered an extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. A most mischievous superstition thus checked for the moment, but again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Christianity was not seen as a positive influence in their society. It was seen as a threat to family values even. It was part of that was the egalitarian nature of male and female within Christian communities. But it's interesting that he mentions Pontius Pilate. Christianity as a world religion is the only religion in existence who their chief central head was lynched by the domination system of their day. This is just a little bit of trivia that's going to come in handy later. Christianity is the only world religion where their central figure was executed by the domination system of its day. That gives you a little bit of a window of what the early followers, where their headspace was. This was a guy that was executed by Rome. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of a crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. So Christians were not thought of very well. Have you ever seen other people who were working for the liberation of the oppressed that are mischaracterized to the masses to make people feel afraid of them? Have you ever seen that dynamic take place socially? Yeah, that's all you're seeing there. Suetonius from 122, the next one we see. My favorite is Lucian, but we'll get to that. Punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. The word there for punishment is afflicti. It meant that it was a capital punishment. It wasn't just punishment, it was execution. That's the kind of punishment it's talking about in the Latin. The punishment that was inflicted upon the Christians was capital. It was lethal. They were losing their life. And the word superstitio or superstition refers to any type, it's not just like we would call superstition, which is harmless. It was any type of ritual observance that could not be incorporated into the traditional Roman religious practice. In other words, it was seen as a threat to the Roman way of life, the Pax Romana. The last one, Lucian. The passing of Peregrinus, he wrote, The Christians you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. So you've seen it over and over again. We have secular historians that refer to his crucifixion at least. So how many would at least be able to buy that story detail? How many can see that's backed up by non-biased sources? All right. That's going to become important in 2 nights from now. That's going to become important. This is not just a story made up by the oppressed. You see, these misguided creatures start with a general conviction that they are immortal for all time. What does he mean by that? It means they had the hope of a resurrection, which explains their contempt for death and voluntary self-devotion, which are so common among them. In other words, when a plague would break out in a city, as everyone else was moving out of the city, the Christians would be moving in to take care of those that were dying, not afraid of catching the plague. They would go to their death singing praises to Jesus. They would not be afraid to die for Jesus. They had no fear of death, and that's what he's referring to. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver. Remember, Jesus is their new lawgiver. They're following the teachings of this Jesus. That they are all brothers. Ladies, they would have considered you sisters too, but this is the top. For how many are thankful we live in the 21st century and not the first? From the moment they are converted and they deny the gods of Greece, and they worship the crucified sage. Notice how he views him. And lives after his laws or his teachings. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike. Some people have accused them of being communist, not in the totalitarian sense, but in holding all things in common, regarding them merely as common property. Accordingly, if any quack or trickster who can press his advantage comes amongst them, he can acquire great wealth in a very short time by imposing on simple-minded people. That was the accusation. I'm not so sure that was true. Paul seems to, in Thessalonians, give some checks and balances. But it just gives you a window into what they were like. What I want you to see in all of this is that, again, if we take away debating story details and we look at teachings, were these people known for following a certain set of teachings first off? So they were focused on ethical teachings rather than debating story details. Am I right? Number 2, were they seen as a political threat to Rome? That's important. Because if all early Christians were focused on was changing people's post-mortem destination, Rome would have never given it a second thought. There were changes in how the world was arranged. And if we can think of these two illustrations that I've made tonight, with those two illustrations alone, arranging the world after those two, would that have had implications and threats to Rome's national interests, empirical interests? So all I'm doing this for is so that you can see there is some historical evidence for the tack that we're going to be taking in this series. That's the boring part. That part's all over. How many are thankful? That's the most boring part of the entire series. You made it through it. You didn't fall asleep, some of you. That's for all of that. What I just went through is for all the skeptics in the room. And I just want to tell you, I resonate with you. I am part of your fabric. I wrestle with these things too. There is enough evidence to look at the story, or to look at the ethical teachings. There is enough evidence to look at the values, the ethics, the teachings of this Jesus of the early Jesus community. I think Jesus was, if I'm going to give you my personal testimony, I think Jesus was worth taking a look at on 3 accounts. As a teacher, he was teacher par excellence. He was an incredible teacher. Not just in his content, but in the form that he tried to communicate that content. Brilliant storyteller. Brilliant storyteller. Radical wisdom, subversive insight. He was great with one-liners that would stick in your head, like wine bursting new wineskins, or old wineskins. Didn't stick in my head, did it? The second reason that I think he's worth taking a look at, not only was he an exceptional teacher, but I am overwhelmed by his passion. And that was for a new social order. He looked at the way the present world was arranged, and he felt compassion for those outside the circles and those at the bottom of the pyramids. And he was passionate about a new social order that he called the kingdom of God. It was about the kingdom. The kingdom has arrived. And lastly, the third thing that I find attractive for me for Jesus is not just what kind of a teacher he was or the passion that I see him in his life having and who that passion was for, but for his courage. And this is what wins me the most. As a Jewish prophet, the Jesus of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John challenged the political, the social, the economic, and the religious domination systems of his day. It would be enough to take on just one of those, wouldn't it? And he took on all of them. He understood where what he was doing would lead. He understood what this would cost him. He understood where he would end up as a result. And he kept at it anyways, out of compassion for the oppressed of the current system. That alone warrants taking a look at this first century Jewish teacher. How many would agree with that? That alone. We don't need to I know we're at different places on all the other stuff. That's enough for this series to take place right there. If that's all that you can start with, that's enough. Marcus Borg, the great Marcus, anybody know the late great Marcus Borg? Does that name ring a bell to anybody? Anybody familiar with Marcus Borg? Anybody? One person? All right, Oklahoma. Marcus Borg. I can say that I'm from West Virginia. We don't even know how to read, much less read Marcus Borg. Some ways of being a Christian seem to be a betrayal of Jesus, Marcus Borg said. I wish half of Christians weren't. That's a great statement. What I would like us to do is to move into what it was like to be a Christian in the early Jesus movement. What that looked like. I understand the objections toward Christianity today, and I share those objections. I'm not going to be defending that in this series. I'm not going to be making excuses for it. I agree. It is not turning on the lights for anyone, and it has been complicit in a lot of abuse. What I would like us to do is to take a look at the early Jesus community. Examples of where Christianity has struggled today is in gender inclusivity. How many have noticed that? The use of torture. That's a hard one. Torture report just came out this winter. Statistics state that the highest populace of America's segment of population, the ones that supported torture the most were white, male, evangelical Christians. From the South. Yeah, that's right. That's my neck of the woods. Christians today support capital punishment. The early Christians would not have. They would have sought to redeem criminals, not execute. Christians' attitude towards war today is very different than attitudes towards war in the first two centuries. And Christians' attitudes today are different in regards to wealth and poverty as they were from what they were, the early Christians. I'm not saying the early Christians got it all right. If you read the New Testament, you will find troubling passages on matters of race, gender, and slavery. What they were coming out of was significant, and I think they were on a trajectory that was making a difference. They were just at this place in that trajectory. The catalyst that set them on that trajectory was these teachings of this man named Jesus that they had encountered. It's up to us to take those teachings and to stand on their shoulders and to go even further in our day today. I'm not saying that, again, the early church got it correct in every way. How many of you look back in some of those passages of the New Testament and you think, why didn't they attack this? How many have ever felt that before? Why didn't they address this? Why didn't they? You're looking at it from your time in Earth's history, not theirs. And so I'm not saying they were faultless. What I'm saying is they were in process. And they were, the fact that they were Jewish men embracing the uncircumcised as Gentiles, as fellow Jesus followers, that was huge for them in their worldview. That was a big change, social change to make. Again, not justifying that they didn't go far enough. I'm saying they went a distance and were to go even further. Today, again, Christianity is the only world religion where their central figure was executed by the established authority of the domination system of his day. I think there's relevance in that for us today. We're not going to be focusing on believing in Jesus as much as we are in following Jesus. And that following, by following, I mean participating in the passion and the courage and the teachings of that Jesus. It's not about believing, it's about participating. Nobody in the New Testament ever extended the invitation. And once again, I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying there's a difference. Nobody extended the invitation in the New Testament to say, would you like to accept Jesus as your personal Savior so you can go to heaven? It was, would you like to, after sharing the story of Jesus and his teachings, they would say, would you like to, you know what the question was? Follow this Jesus. So that's what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be focusing more on participating with Jesus' vision for a new world, that mustard seed, that pearl of great price, rather than just believing certain things that get us a post-mortem change. And I hope that's enough. Why think this is true? I'm going to lay before you what I think the story truth is, what I think it is for the Jesus story. And simply be asking you if those ethics resonate with you, and if the kind of world that Jesus was trying to create resonates with you as well. And maybe this will be a refresher for many of you. Maybe it'll be a rediscovery for many of you. I have a hunch that there will be some of you in this room, and I'm not meaning the non-religious. Some of you this week will have a story just like mine, where you've been a Christian for years, and you feel like you're bumping into the teachings of Jesus for the very first time. Thank you guys for coming. Give yourselves a hand. Thank you for being here tonight. If you have any questions, make sure you write them down, and we'll be going from